On a late autumn evening in Manhattan, the kind of evening where the wind carried the scent of rain before the clouds ever broke, the most exclusive restaurant in the city opened its doors to a crowd that mattered more than most crowds ever would. Every camera lens in the room turned the moment Amelia Carter stepped through the entrance, her heels striking the marble floor with the same precision she brought to every boardroom she had ever commanded. Beside her walked a man very few people recognized. A quiet, broad-shouldered figure in a simple charcoal suit, his hands slightly rough from years spent bent over machinery rather than spreadsheets. His name was Noah Parker, an engineer, a single father, a man who had spent his whole career avoiding exactly this kind of spotlight. And yet, because they laughed together like two people who shared history, because their conversation felt easy in a room built entirely on tension, the entire hall reached the same conclusion within minutes. They believed, without a single word of confirmation, that Amelia Carter had finally found someone. Noah opened his mouth to correct the assumption forming around them like smoke curling toward a ceiling. Amelia only smiled, a small, unreadable curve of her lips, and said nothing at all, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. Neither of them yet understood that this single unspoken moment, so small it barely registered as a decision, would rewrite the course of their careers, their reputations, and eventually, their hearts. The chandelier above them scattered light across the room, like scattered stars caught indoors. And somewhere near the bar, a waiter paused mid-step, sensing that something significant had just quietly begun without anyone announcing it. Noah Parker was 38 years old, a man who measured his days in torque specifications and flight tolerances rather than headlines or quarterly earnings calls. He raised his daughter alone, though she never appeared at events like this one, kept carefully apart from a world he did not trust and did not wish to expose her to. He was, by every account that mattered in his field, a genius, one of the finest mechanical engineers of his generation, a man whose designs for aircraft engines had quietly reshaped an entire industry without his name ever appearing above the fold of a single newspaper. He disliked cameras with a quiet, unwavering consistency. He disliked small talk even more, finding most of it a waste of the limited hours in any given day. He wore the same handful of suits on rotation and had never once cared what anyone thought about it, choosing function over performance in nearly every aspect of his life. That evening, he had been invited by a partner corporation eager to secure his expertise because the contract on the table was worth several $100 million, and no serious deal of that size ever closes without a dinner first, without the ritual of expensive wine and careful conversation designed to build trust before signatures. Noah had almost declined the invitation 3 separate times before finally agreeing, mostly because his daughter had told him, half joking, that he needed to leave the garage occasionally and remember what other people looked like. Across the room, and in many ways across an entirely different universe, stood Amelia Carter. She was 35 years old, the chief executive of Hale Aerospace, a company she had built into one of the most formidable names in the industry through sheer force of intellect and an unwillingness to ever appear weak in front of anyone. The press had given her a nickname years ago, one that followed her into every interview and every headline like a shadow she could never quite outrun. They called her the Ice Queen, a title she had never publicly acknowledged and privately despised, though she had long since stopped correcting anyone who used it. Competitors feared her instincts and her memory for detail. Employees respected her from a careful distance, admiring her without ever quite feeling close to her. Investors trusted her judgment even when they could not always explain the reasoning behind it, because her track record spoke more loudly than any explanation ever could. What almost no one in that glittering room understood, what no headline had ever managed to capture in 8 years of coverage, was that beneath the composed exterior, Amelia Carter was profoundly, quietly lonely, a woman who had built an empire and somehow forgotten how to simply sit across from another human being without calculating the angle of every word she spoke. They arrived at the restaurant separately in theory, but the timing placed them at the entrance within seconds of each other. And from that instant, every camera in the room turned toward Amelia, the way sunflowers turn toward light without needing to be told. No one paid much attention to Noah at first. and for those first few seconds, he existed the way he always had, unnoticed and untouched by the machinery of public perception that surrounded a woman like Amelia everywhere she went. That brief, ordinary anonymity was the last quiet moment either of them would experience for a very long time, though neither of them realized it as they crossed the threshold together. It happened just inside the main doors, beneath a chandelier that scattered light like a held breath across the polished floor. Noah and Amelia recognized each other instantly, because 3 years earlier they had worked together on an engine development project that had, at the time, seemed destined to fail before either of them found a way to make it succeed. Amelia stepped forward first, her voice carrying the same measured warmth she used sparingly, and only when she genuinely meant it, a warmth few people outside her closest circle had ever heard directed at them. "It has been a long time," she said. And something in her tone made the simple words sound like far more than a casual greeting between old colleagues. Noah smiled, an easy, genuine smile that few people ever saw directed at anyone in his professional orbit. A smile his daughter would have recognized instantly as the one he reserved for people he actually trusted. The two of them fell into conversation as naturally as if the 3 intervening years had never happened at all, discussing old projects and new developments with the easy shorthand of people who had once solved difficult problems together late into the night. They walked side by side toward the reception area, talking quietly, oblivious for a moment to the room slowly reorganizing itself around their presence, whispers beginning to ripple outward from the tables nearest the door. An investor nearby, a man known for noticing everything that might affect his portfolio before anyone else did, watched the exchange with open curiosity, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the ease between them. He leaned toward a colleague and asked the question that would ignite everything that followed, phrasing it almost like an accusation dressed carefully as small talk. "Did the two of them arrive together tonight?" he wondered aloud, watching Amelia's face for any flicker of reaction. Amelia did not deny it. She simply let the question hang in the air, unanswered, her expression giving nothing away to a room full of people trained to read expressions for a living. Noah opened his mouth to explain the truth, to say plainly that they had merely encountered each other by circumstance near the entrance. Nothing more. Nothing arranged. But before he could speak a single word, Amelia had already turned the conversation toward the evening's agenda, redirecting attention with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a decade steering rooms exactly where she wanted them to go, a skill so natural to her that Noah almost missed the moment it happened at all. He glanced at her, puzzled, but said nothing further, deciding to let the moment pass rather than make a scene in front of strangers who mattered a great deal to the contract he had come here to secure. The rumor did not simply spread through the room. It detonated, moving from table to table with the speed of something already half believed before it was even fully spoken aloud. Within 20 minutes, whispers had gathered embellishment with every retelling, growing more certain and more detailed with each new voice that carried it forward, until the entire room had quietly agreed on a single narrative without anyone ever formally confirming it. The Ice Queen, the untouchable, unreachable chief executive of Hale Aerospace, had finally brought someone to a public event, and the entire industry seemed to exhale collectively at the novelty of it. Somewhere near the bar, a reporter who had not been officially invited to cover business, but had come anyway on a hunch, sensing something newsworthy in the air, lifted her phone and captured a single photograph of Noah's hand, resting lightly on the small of Amelia's back, as he guided her past a crowded table toward their seats. The photograph would be circulating online before either of them ever left the building that night. Tagged and shared and captioned with speculation, neither of them had any say in shaping. Neither Noah nor Amelia knew, in that moment, that the image already existed, already spreading outward into a world that would soon have opinions about a relationship that had never actually been declared. What no one in that room anticipated, least of all Amelia herself, was how quickly the misunderstanding would begin working in their favor at the negotiating table. Within the hour, the partners and investors who had come to discuss the aerospace contract began treating Noah with a warmth and deference he had never once experienced in a professional setting before that night. They no longer saw him as simply an engineer summoned to consult on technical specifications buried deep in a proposal. They saw him now, whether accurately or not, as a man connected to considerable power, someone whose opinions suddenly carried unexpected weight in a room where weight had always been reserved for people with titles far grander than his own. He was, in their eyes, suddenly polished, composed, someone worth listening to closely rather than politely tolerating, until the real decision-makers finally spoke. Amelia noticed the shift almost immediately. The way the entire atmosphere of the negotiation softened around them, the way arguments that would normally have taken hours to resolve, seemed to settle themselves in a fraction of the usual time. Executives who typically hedged every sentence with layers of legal caution began speaking more openly, more warmly, as though some invisible tension in the room had simply dissolved the moment the two of them sat down together at the table. During a brief pause near the terrace doors, where the autumn air had grown sharp enough to raise goosebumps on bare arms, Noah pulled her aside and asked the question that had been building in him since the investor's remark at the entrance. Why had she not simply corrected the misunderstanding the moment it began, before it had the chance to grow into something neither of them could easily walk back? Amelia's answer came with a faint, knowing smile, one that revealed nothing and somehow everything at once, a smile that had closed 100 negotiations without ever needing accompanying words. She told him she wanted to let the situation continue a little longer, simply to see where it might lead them both. Noah found himself more confused than annoyed by the answer, unable to decide whether her decision reflected calculated strategy or something else entirely, something even she had not yet found the words to name for herself. By the end of the evening, the first contract of the larger deal had been signed with considerably less friction than either side had anticipated walking in, and neither Noah nor Amelia fully understood yet exactly what they had actually agreed to that night, beyond the paperwork sitting between them. In the weeks that followed, the two of them found themselves thrown together far more often than either had anticipated when that first evening began. There were meetings that stretched late into the night, long past when most of the staff had gone home, site inspections at the manufacturing plant where prototypes were tested under harsh fluorescent lights, and dinners with investors who now specifically requested that Noah be present, believing his connection to Amelia lent the negotiations a certain human warmth that pure business language never quite managed to achieve on its own. The rumor, rather than fading, as most rumors eventually do, grew larger with every appearance they made together, spreading outward from industry newsletters into wider financial press coverage until their supposed relationship had become something of an open secret, whispered about at every gathering either of them attended. And yet, through all of it, through every headline and every whispered aside, Amelia never once tried to use Noah for her own advantage in any negotiation or public appearance. She treated him with a consistent, quiet respect that surprised him more deeply than the rumor itself ever had. She listened, genuinely listened, when he raised concerns about engine tolerances that other executives in the room would have dismissed outright without a second thought. She never spoke over him in meetings, never positioned him as a convenient prop for her own narrative, never once asked him to perform anything he was not entirely comfortable performing in front of strangers. Slowly, carefully, over the course of many small, unremarkable moments, Noah began to notice something beneath the composed exterior the world had grown so thoroughly accustomed to seeing in every photograph and interview. He began to see not the chief executive the headlines endlessly described in the same tired language, but a woman who carried an exhaustion so deep it had become invisible even to the people closest to her, herself included most of all. She rubbed her temples when she thought no one was watching. She sometimes stared out windows during meetings, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely, before catching herself and returning to the conversation with practiced smoothness. The turning point arrived on an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every outward way. In a conference room long emptied of its usual occupants, papers scattered across the table from a negotiation that had run far past its scheduled end. Amelia sat back in her chair, rubbing at her temple, and said something that seemed to surprise even her as it left her mouth without permission. She told him she had forgotten what it felt like to simply have a conversation, one that was not calculated, not strategic, not designed to move toward some predetermined outcome she had already mapped out in advance. Noah did not respond right away, giving the words space to settle rather than rushing to fill the silence the way most people instinctively would. He simply looked at her, steady and unhurried. And in that silence, something between them shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a single degree of temperature can change the entire texture of the air in a room without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened. From that evening forward, Amelia began speaking more openly, revealing pieces of herself she had kept locked away for years behind schedules and quarterly reports and carefully worded press statements. She confessed, almost offhandedly, staring at her own hands rather than at him, that every meal she ate in public had become, in some sense, a form of work. Every smile she offered a camera was analyzed the following morning by strategists paid handsomely to interpret her expressions for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Every decision she made as chief executive was picked apart by boards and shareholders and journalists who had never built anything themselves but felt entirely entitled to judge everything she had spent her life constructing. No one, she admitted quietly, had ever simply asked her if she was tired. Not once, not in 8 years. Noah's response was almost startlingly simple, arriving without hesitation or performance. He told her that he was asking. 2 words spoken plainly. Without any attempt to impress her or soften the moment with charm, she would have immediately recognized and dismissed as insincere. Amelia said nothing for a long time afterward, staring at the table between them as though she were seeing something entirely new in its plain wooden surface. Something she had never allowed herself to notice before. It was, though neither of them said it aloud that night, the first time in longer than she could clearly remember that someone had asked about her well-being without wanting something from her in return. Something in her eyes changed after that night, a softness that had not been there before, subtle enough that only someone paying very close attention would have noticed it at all. Noah found himself thinking about it long after he had driven home, long after he had checked on his sleeping daughter and sat alone in his kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He told himself it meant nothing beyond simple human decency, the kind any reasonable person would extend to a colleague under obvious strain, but some quiet, honest part of him already suspected that explanation was no longer entirely true. The weeks that followed carried the two of them through an easy, unhurried rhythm that neither had expected when this entire situation began, with a single misread greeting at a restaurant entrance. They tested prototype engines together on cold mornings at the manufacturing facility, breath visible in the chilled air of the testing bay, walking the production floor discussing tolerances and failure points, with an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a rare, mutual respect for each other's competence. They shared dinners after long days, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in conversation that wandered far from business into subjects neither of them usually discussed with anyone else in their lives. Noah never flattered her, not once, not even when flattery might have served him well, in a company that clearly valued her opinion above all others. He challenged her when he believed she was wrong, pushed back on her assumptions during meetings without hesitation or diplomatic softening, refused to simply agree because agreement would have been the easier, safer path forward. Amelia found, to her own quiet surprise, that she liked him more precisely because of this refusal to flatter her, not despite it, having spent years surrounded by people who agreed with everything she said the instant she said it. For his part, Noah began to see a version of Amelia the public had never once been permitted to witness in any interview or profile piece. She was sincere in ways the press coverage never suggested was possible for a woman with her reputation, capable of genuine warmth beneath the composed exterior she wore, like carefully fitted armor every single day. One evening, caught in an unexpected downpour outside the manufacturing plant, thunder rolling somewhere distant over the river, Noah shrugged off his jacket without a word and settled it over her shoulders before either of them had time to think carefully about what the small gesture might actually mean. Amelia laughed softly, water running down her face and dripping from the ends of her hair, and told him that no one had ever worried about her getting cold before, not in any way she could clearly remember. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone watching from a distance, easily missed by any camera that might have happened to catch it, but it settled somewhere deep in both of them, a quiet marker of something neither was yet fully ready to name aloud, something that felt far too fragile to examine too closely under the bright lights of scrutiny that followed them everywhere else. There were quieter moments too, moments that never made it into any photograph or any whispered conversation among investors, moments that belonged only to the two of them. On a Sunday afternoon, when neither of them had any meeting scheduled and the manufacturing plant sat empty and silent, Amelia found herself standing in the doorway of Noah's small office, watching him sketch a modification to a turbine blade on a napkin because he had left his notebook at home. She asked him, almost shyly, what it was like raising a daughter alone, a question she had never dared to ask anyone in her professional circle before that moment. Noah set down his pencil and told her, honestly, that it was the hardest and most rewarding thing he had ever done, harder than any engine he had ever designed, more rewarding than any contract he had ever signed. He spoke about the small victories that no headline would ever cover, the way his daughter had finally learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels the previous spring, the way she asked impossible questions about gravity and flight that sometimes stumped even him. Amelia listened without interrupting, something rare for a woman accustomed to steering every conversation toward an outcome. And when he finished speaking, she admitted quietly that she had always assumed a life like his, ordinary and rooted and full of small, unglamorous joys, was somehow beyond her reach. Noah looked at her carefully, studying the sadness that flickered briefly across her face before she could smooth it away, and told her that nothing about her life had to remain the way it currently was, that she was allowed to want more than boardrooms and quarterly reports. The remark stayed with her longer than either of them expected it to. In the weeks that followed, Amelia began arriving at the office slightly later than usual, choosing instead to eat breakfast at her kitchen table, rather than in the back seat of a car speeding toward her first meeting. She began declining a handful of invitations she once would have accepted automatically, protecting small pockets of her calendar, the way she had once protected only her most important negotiations. Her assistant noticed the change first, remarking to a colleague that the chief executive seemed, for lack of a better word, lighter, though neither of them could quite explain why. Noah noticed it too, of course, in the small things that mattered most. She laughed more easily during meetings, a genuine sound rather than the practiced, polite version she had once offered to satisfy a room. She asked him questions about his work that had nothing to do with the current contract, curious, simply because she wanted to understand the world he inhabited, rather than because curiosity served any strategic purpose. Slowly, without either of them ever formally acknowledging it aloud, the boundary between colleagues and something else entirely had begun to blur in ways that felt inevitable, rather than sudden, the way a tide rises so gradually that no single wave can be blamed for the change. Not everyone, however, was content to simply watch this story unfold without interference from the sidelines. A rival chief executive, a man who had spent years trying and consistently failing to undermine Hale Aerospace's dominance in the industry, saw a rare opportunity in the persistent rumors surrounding Amelia and Noah. He hired investigators quietly, confident that exposing the relationship as fabricated entirely would humiliate Amelia publicly and destabilize the company. At a moment when investor confidence mattered more than almost anything else on the horizon, the investigation uncovered exactly what the rival had hoped it would find from the very beginning. There was no romance, no formal relationship, nothing beneath the surface beyond an unclaimed misunderstanding that had simply been allowed to persist far longer than either of them had ever intended. Armed with this information, carefully organized into a presentation designed for maximum damage, he began preparing a press conference intended to paint Amelia as a woman who had deliberately deceived investors and the public alike for personal gain or corporate advantage, a narrative crafted to be as damaging as possible. The board of directors at Hale Aerospace reacted with immediate alarm the moment word of the rivals' plans reached their offices through back channels. Shares in the company began to fluctuate noticeably, as speculation spread through financial circles faster than anyone inside the company could adequately control or contain it. Reporters who had once treated the supposed relationship as a charming footnote to a much larger business story now sharpened their questions considerably, sensing the possibility of a genuine scandal large enough to dominate headlines for days rather than a single afternoon news cycle. And then, without warning, a breaking news segment aired on national television during the evening broadcast, framing the entire situation as a calculated deception, orchestrated by one of the most powerful women in American business, complete with dramatic music and carefully selected photographs designed to suggest guilt before any facts had even been confirmed. The days that followed felt, to both Amelia and Noah, like standing in the center of a storm that refused to weaken no matter which direction they turned for shelter. Journalists camped outside the Hale Aerospace headquarters around the clock. Cameras trained on every entrance and exit, waiting patiently for a statement that had not yet been prepared or approved. The board demanded a public apology from Amelia, insisting that she distance herself from Noah immediately to protect the company's reputation before the damage became entirely irreversible and impossible to walk back. Noah, watching the chaos unfold around a woman he had come to genuinely admire over these past several weeks, began to believe that he himself was the true source of the crisis, that his mere presence beside her had somehow caused all of this destruction to rain down on a company she had spent her entire adult life carefully building. He told her, quietly and without any dramatic flourish, that he intended to withdraw from the project entirely, believing it was the only way left to protect both her and the company from further harm. Amelia would not allow it, refusing the moment the words left his mouth with a firmness that surprised them both. For the first time since the evening they had reunited at that glittering restaurant so many weeks earlier, she let him see something entirely unguarded in her expression, something far closer to genuine fear than anything the relentless press had ever managed to provoke in her over the years. She told him, plainly and without hesitation, that she did not want him to disappear from her life or from the project, and the words landed heavier than either of them had expected, hanging in the still air of the office, long after she had spoken them aloud. Noah stood very still, searching her face carefully for some hidden strategy, some calculated angle lurking behind the statement she had just made, and found absolutely none waiting there for him to discover. It was, simply and entirely, the truth, spoken by a woman who rarely allowed herself the vulnerability of saying exactly what she meant without careful editing first. Within hours, the board announced that a press conference would be held to address the growing scandal directly and publicly, and both of them understood clearly that whatever happened inside that room would determine far more than the fate of a single business contract between two companies. The press conference took place on a gray, overcast afternoon, the room packed wall to wall, with hundreds of reporters. Cameras stacked 3 deep along the back wall, every major network in the country, waiting to broadcast whatever admission or denial Amelia was finally prepared to offer them. She stood at the podium, composed as always in front of a crowd, though those who knew her well could see the unmistakable tension gathered in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. Before she could speak more than a few carefully prepared opening remarks, Noah rose from his seat near the front of the room and walked toward the stage, a move no one in that room had anticipated, least of all Amelia herself. He took the microphone from her, with the same steady calm he brought to every engine test he had ever personally supervised. And he began to speak without notes, without hesitation, without a single trace of the discomfort he usually felt standing in front of cameras pointed directly at him. From the very beginning, he told the room, his voice carrying clearly through the silence, neither of them had ever once claimed to be a couple, not to a single reporter, not to a single investor, not to anyone who had asked. The assumption, he explained calmly, belonged entirely to the public and the press, conclusions drawn from nothing more substantial than two people who happened to genuinely enjoy each other's company. What he did know, he continued, his voice steady even as the entire room fell into absolute, unbroken silence, was that Amelia Carter was the most honest, principled person he had ever had the privilege of working alongside in his entire career. The room remained still for a long moment after he finished speaking, the particular kind of silence that follows something true rather than something carefully rehearsed for effect, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the coverage that followed began to shift decisively in her favor. Amelia stood watching him from just behind the podium, visibly moved in a way the cameras had never once captured her being before in 8 years of public scrutiny. And when she finally reached for the microphone herself, no one in the room had any idea what she was actually about to say next. She looked at Noah for a long moment before she spoke a single word, the kind of look that seemed to carry an entire unspoken conversation within it, understood only by the two of them and no one else in that crowded room. Then, with a calm that surprised even the veteran reporters who had covered her for years and thought they knew every version of her, she told the room the truth she had been quietly carrying since that very first evening at the restaurant, so many weeks before. She had never corrected the misunderstanding, she admitted openly, and everyone had naturally assumed it was strategy, a calculated business decision designed carefully to soften negotiations and win over cautious investors. But the real reason, she confessed, her voice steady despite the weight of the admission, was far simpler than anyone in that room had ever guessed or reported. She had not wanted to deny what she was beginning to feel, she said, even before she had fully understood or accepted it herself. The room fell into stunned silence, hundreds of reporters frozen mid-motion, cameras still rolling as the true story unfolded live in front of the entire watching country. No rehearsed statement, no careful spin, only the plain truth spoken aloud for the first time. Noah crossed the small distance of stage between them and took her hand, gently, deliberately, in front of everyone who had spent weeks speculating endlessly about the true nature of their relationship. For the first time since that chandelier-lit evening months earlier, what stood between them was no longer a misunderstanding manufactured by strangers, no longer a rumor born from a single unanswered question at a restaurant entrance. It was, at last, a genuine choice they had made together, spoken aloud and witnessed openly by the very public that had once threatened to tear the entire thing apart before it ever had a real chance to become something honest. In the days immediately following the press conference, the two of them found themselves navigating a strange new territory neither had ever prepared for, a public relationship that was, for the first time, entirely real rather than assumed. Reporters who had once hunted for scandal now requested interviews about romance instead, eager to reconstruct the story from its beginning with a far gentler lens than they had used only weeks before. Amelia handled the sudden attention with the same composure she brought to every negotiation, though Noah noticed she now allowed herself small moments of visible happiness in public that she once would have carefully suppressed for the cameras. His daughter, upon learning that her father's name had appeared in the news for reasons entirely unrelated to engineering, asked him with the blunt honesty only a child could manage whether Amelia was going to be around for a while. Noah, sitting at their kitchen table with the newspaper folded between them, told her that he certainly hoped so, and found himself surprised by how easily the words came, how little hesitation lived behind them now. A few weeks later, Amelia was invited to their small house for dinner, an evening that involved considerably more laughter and considerably less formality than any boardroom she had ever occupied, and she left that night feeling something she struggled afterward to name, something close to belonging. The transition was not without its difficulties, of course, because two people who had built their lives around very different rhythms could not simply merge those rhythms overnight without friction. Amelia's schedule still pulled her toward early mornings and late nights, more often than either of them would have liked, and Noah occasionally found himself frustrated by the way her work seemed to follow them into rooms it had no business entering. But they talked through the friction rather than around it, choosing honest conversation over the kind of quiet resentment that ends relationships slowly and silently over the course of years. Each disagreement became, in its own way, another brick laid carefully in a foundation neither of them intended to abandon. A year passed after that afternoon, carrying with it the kind of quiet transformation that headlines rarely manage to capture, but that shapes a life far more permanently than any single scandal ever could. Hale Aerospace completed the largest aviation project in the company's entire history, a milestone that solidified its place firmly at the very top of the industry, and silenced whatever remained of the rival executives' efforts to destabilize it from the outside. Noah was promoted to Chief Technical Officer, a position he earned entirely through the strength of his engineering work, rather than any perceived connection to the woman beside him, a distinction he made absolutely certain the board understood clearly before he agreed to accept the role at all. She began delegating tasks she once insisted on handling personally, trusting a team she had spent years training precisely for moments like these, and discovered, somewhat to her own astonishment, that the company continued running smoothly without her hovering over every decision. Amelia, for her part, made a decision that surprised many people who had only ever known her as relentless and endlessly unyielding in every aspect of her professional life. She scaled back her schedule deliberately, carving out real space for a life that existed beyond boardrooms and quarterly earnings calls, choosing balance over the constant, exhausting motion that had defined nearly every year of her adult life before that. She began taking weekends fully offline, something her assistant had once believed genuinely impossible for her to sustain for more than a single day at a time. She took up small, ordinary hobbies she had abandoned in her 20s, tending a modest herb garden on her apartment balcony, and returning, tentatively at first, to a piano she had not touched in nearly a decade. Colleagues who visited her apartment for the first time were often surprised to find it warm and lived in, filled with books and photographs rather than the sterile minimalism the press had always imagined for her. The two of them appeared together at a company gala, held to celebrate the aviation project's completion. The same kind of glittering, camera-filled room where their entire story had first begun almost exactly a year earlier. A reporter, recognizing the poetic symmetry of the moment immediately, approached with a knowing smile and asked whether the two of them expected to be misunderstood again by everyone watching them tonight. Amelia turned to look at Noah, the same unreadable warmth in her eyes that had first sparked the original rumor so many months before, an expression that had only grown more genuine with time rather than less. She answered with a quiet certainty that needed no further explanation or elaboration for anyone listening closely. This time, she said, there was nothing left for anyone to misunderstand. This time, she added, glancing once more at Noah before looking back toward the reporter, everyone watching had finally gotten it right. And there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to hide, and nothing left unsaid between the two of them that mattered. Looking back, neither of them could point to a single dramatic moment when everything changed. No grand gesture, no rehearsed declaration delivered beneath fireworks or city lights. Instead, the story of their beginning was made up almost entirely of small, unremarkable choices. A jacket offered in the rain, a question asked sincerely in an empty conference room, a hand that stayed instead of pulling away. Amelia often told close friends, when they asked how it had all started, that the misunderstanding had simply given them permission to stand closer together than either of them would have dared on their own, and that everything true between them had grown quietly in the space that permission created. Noah, for his part, rarely spoke about it in grand terms at all, preferring instead to describe it the way he described any well-built machine, as something that worked because every small part had been placed correctly and allowed to do its job without interference. His daughter, older now, and far more curious about the world beyond their kitchen table, sometimes asked him to tell the story again, and he always ended it the same way, reminding her that the world had gotten the wrong idea at first, but that sometimes the wrong idea, given enough honesty and enough time, has a way of quietly becoming true. What began as an assumption whispered across a crowded restaurant had, in the end, become something neither of them could have manufactured through calculation or careful strategy no matter how hard they tried. Reputation may start with a misunderstanding, built on nothing more substantial than the conclusions strangers choose to draw from a single laugh or a single hand resting briefly on a back. But love, real and lasting, can only ever be built the slow and honest way, through respect offered without condition, through trust earned one quiet evening at a time, and through the simple, unglamorous choice to keep showing up for someone even when the entire world is watching closely and waiting for the whole thing to fall apart.